Everyone. I'm Glenn Silloway with the League of Women Voters of San Luis Obispo County. Welcome to today's Lunch with the League webinar, ICE and the Law, Rights, Limits, and Accountability. This webinar is the third event in a series to consider the social and legal status of people living on the Central Coast who are immigrants or have undocumented citizenship status. The first was an in-person event in September 2025 titled Our Immigrant Community, Contributions and Current Challenges. It focused on the social and economic challenges of members of the immigrant community. It included a panel discussion moderated by League board member Kim Gravel. The second was a webinar in late October 2025 titled Understanding Local Law Enforcement and Immigration Issues, that looked at how California law defined the permissible level of cooperation between local law enforcement and Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE. The panel of the sheriff and 3 local chiefs of police was moderated by retired SLO City Chief of Police Jim Gardner. Today's webinar, moderated by Rita Casaverde, looks more closely at what the legal constraints on Homeland Security immigration enforcement are and how this impacts the everyday lives of people at the grassroots. We provide access to all recorded League events at our YouTube channel, which you can find at League of Women Voters of San Luis Obispo County. Today's webinar will be posted in about 3 days, and people who prefer using Spanish will be able to access closed captions then. Now, before I introduce Rita, there's a couple housekeeping points. We're scheduled to run today from noon to about 1 p.m., but we often go over a bit if there are good questions in the Q&A. Obviously, you are free to leave at any time, but we will come to a hard stop at about 1:15 or 1:20 if we do run over. Q&A is open anytime, starting now. However, we will not answer the questions until after the main part of the presentation is over, and then Rita will lead the Q&A session. We'll get to as many questions as we can in that allotted time. Chat is not available. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Rita Casaverde. She is the Executive Director of the Diversity Coalition in San Luis Obispo County. Born and raised in Lima, Peru, she brings lived experience as an immigrant to her work. She has supported immigrant families on the Central Coast through direct assistance, legal referrals, and community organizing, and previously worked on immigration and social justice in Congressman Salud Carvajal's office. Today, she focuses on advancing equity and ensuring immigrant communities have access to resources and representation. Over to you, Rita.
Thank you so much, Glenn. Thank you for everyone that is currently here watching this webinar. We're going to get started. Today's conversation centers on immigration enforcement, constitutional protections, legal realities, and accountability. For a long time, immigration enforcement has felt like an abstract political issue to many people, but increasingly communities are realizing its impacts are deeply local. They affect schools, workplaces, neighborhoods, and families across the Central Coast. Nearly half of all children in California have at least one immigrant parent, including my own. So when we talk about immigration enforcement, detention, or due process, we are often talking about our neighbors, our coworkers, or friends. Tonight's discussion is not about whether laws exist, but about how enforcement operates within constitutional limits, due process, and human dignity, and what changes communities are seeing under the current Trump administration. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our panelists. Today we have Dr. Jared Van Ramshorst. Jared is a political geographer who specializes in borders, immigration, and Latino, Latina, Latinx studies. His research focuses on immigration from Central and South America to the U.S. and the ways in which immigrants grapple with border and immigration enforcement, policing, and surveillance across North America. Using an interdisciplinary approach, he analyzes recent iterations of law and policy to explore questions around belonging, citizenship, race and ethnicity, and violence. We will also have Sarah Goss. Sarah is a staff attorney with the San Luis Obispo Legal Assistance Foundation. Her work includes helping clients with immigration issues. Prior to joining SLOLAF, she worked in private practice as an immigration lawyer for over 20 years. She earned her JD from Wayne State University Law School. We also will have Primitiva Hernandez. Primitiva is the executive director of 805 on DocuFund with headquarters in Lompoc, but presence in Ventura, Santa Barbara, and SLO County. As an immigrant-led organization, 805 on DocuFund centers the lived experiences of its staff and leadership, operating on the firm belief that those closest to the problems possess the insight and power to lead the solutions. Founded in 2018 as a disaster relief organization, the group has evolved to take on a central role in serving the immigrant community. One of Primitiva's most important responsibilities is overseeing the 805 Rapid Response Network to monitor, verify, and document ICE immigration enforcement activities in the 805 area, including San Luis Obispo, Santa Barbara, and Ventura counties, ensuring that the community's own voices guide the defense of their rights and safety. So, without further ado, we're going to move on to our panel. And we're going to start with Jared. Jared, let me know if there you are. Jared, public conversations about immigration often focus on enforcement and criminality. And also, a lot of politicians only talk about border security when we talk about immigration. But before we dive into the legal and human impacts of those policies, can you help us understand where we are currently when it comes to immigration enforcement? But more importantly, how and why has immigration enforcement become such a central part of the national conversation?
Absolutely. Thank you, Rita, for the introduction. And I don't have very much time, so I'm going to move quickly through this. And I encourage all of you to please ask questions or voice curiosities at the end of all of the panelists. So a few months ago, on January 24th, Alex Preddy, a 37-year-old man from Minnesota, was shot multiple times and killed by two Customs and Border Protection, or CBP, officers. As many of you probably know, Preddy was filming two CBP officers on his phone and at one point had stepped in to stand in between an officer and a woman that had been pushed to the ground. And a struggle ensued before roughly 6 or so CBP officers wrestled Preddy to the ground and he was shot and killed. Of course, less than 3 weeks earlier, Renee Good, also coincidentally 37 years old, was fatally shot by not CBP, but Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE agent Jonathan Ross, also in Minnesota. And here, Good was stopped sideways in her car before she reversed and began moving forward, during which Ross, the agent who was positioned to the left of Good, fired 3 shots into the vehicle as Good passed by him. Now, in both instances, the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, and CBP, as well as ICE, all claimed self-defense. And these claims were quickly disproved following the release of audio and video evidence. Preddy and Good, however, have not been the only ones killed in recent interactions with CBP and ICE. For instance, Silvero Villegas Gonzalez, a 38-year-old man in Chicago, was killed upon fleeing from a traffic stop in September of last year, just after dropping his children off at school. And similarly, Keith Porter Jr. was killed by an off-duty ICE agent in December outside of his house in Northridge, California, just a few hours away from us here in San Luis Obispo. So how did we get here? Today, I'm going to provide a brief historical and institutional context that sheds light on contemporary border and immigration enforcement. There isn't nearly enough time to really cover a broad history of immigration law and policy, which is what I study as an immigration scholar. But I think perhaps one of the earliest and most notable starting places is actually the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. Which prohibited immigration of Chinese immigrants explicitly for 10 years and even excluded Chinese residents living in the United States from obtaining citizenship. The image that you see here is actually from 1901, a year before the United States made this exclusion of Chinese immigrants permanent, until it was eventually repealed in 1943, more than 60 years later. Now, the Chinese Exclusion Act was just one of several racialized anti-Chinese and anti-immigrant laws passed around this time in the 19th century, including others like the Page Act of 1875 and, as you see here, the Scott Act of 1888, all of which prevented Chinese immigrants who left the United States from re-entering, even if they had obtained proper authorization to do so. Now, these laws are noteworthy for a number of reasons, and the first of which is that they both mobilized and relied upon a kind of racialized discourse that portrayed Chinese immigrants as dangerous, as depraved, and as existential threats to whiteness, in particular in the United States. For instance, the political cartoon that you see here was taken from around the same time, and it depicts a caricature of a Chinese man who has just murdered an Anglo white woman with both gun and knife. Around this same time, Chinese immigrants were frequently represented as economic threats to white laborers. They were represented as carriers of disease and sickness. And many of these likely sound familiar to all of you, given the kind of language and rhetoric used nowadays to describe not necessarily Chinese immigrants, but in particular Latina, Latino, and Latinx immigrants in the United States as either, quote, criminals, drug dealers, and rapists, end quote, or as killers, and so on and so forth. But the Chinese Exclusion Act and its associated legal foundation are also noteworthy because they gave rise to what I think is probably one of the most important legal doctrines in immigration law and policy. And all of this happened through a single Supreme Court case that played out at the time, which was known as Che Chan Ping versus the United States. And I won't get into the weeds of what the particular Supreme Court case was about, but the decision that the Supreme Court handed down granted broad judicial deference to the executive and legislative branches of government. And it also set forth a precedent known as plenary authority or plenary power, which is more or less a kind of legal doctrine that holds that both Congress and the president have an exclusive and intrinsic power over immigration and nationality law, so that judicial oversight or review is itself limited. In other words, Congress has expansive authority to create immigration law and policy with little judicial interference, and the president has expansive authority to enforce immigration law and policy with little judicial interference, something that we can certainly see is being extended, expanded, and perhaps abused nowadays. There is, of course, a much longer history to immigration law and policy, but given the time constraints today, I want to draw attention to just one contemporary instance that might help shine a light on where we are today. In fact, the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act, often referred to as IIRA in 1996, is probably the single most important piece of legislation ever conceived of around immigration law and policy in the US. The bill was signed into law in September of 1996 under then President Bill Clinton, and it did a number of significant things. One of those things was that it expanded the legal category or classification of a series of crimes known as aggravated felonies. Beforehand, these would include things like murder or firearm trafficking, but after this new law was passed in 1996, this category of aggravated felony was expanded so that it would apply to a number of different infractions, often civil or misdemeanor infractions, that immigrants might commit, such as document fraud, obstruction of justice, petty theft, and even failure to appear in court. In practice, what this did is it transformed low-level, often civil or even misdemeanor crimes or infractions into serious felony offenses for immigrants only. Another thing that IIRA did was implement mandatory detention and also implemented summary deportation or removal. Mandatory detention refers to the ways in which many immigrants are mandated to be detained, imprisoned, or incarcerated if they commit a certain level of crime, often included in this aggravated felony category. Summary deportation or removal actually is comprised of three different ways in which the government is able to deport undocumented immigrants in the United States or those with precarious legal status based on a very simple set of criteria that often eliminates judicial oversight or judicial review, which means that many decisions around deportation nowadays are usually done by ICE agents based on a simple set of criteria. Finally, the IIRA also systematized 287G of the Immigration and Nationality Act. And again, I don't have nearly enough time to talk about all of these things today, but this program allows city, county, and state level corrections officers, police officers, and sheriffs to really conduct border and immigration enforcement, which typically is by law a federal responsibility. Here in California, we actually have a law on the books that prevents something like this from happening, but the 287G program is very popular in states like Florida, Texas, and so on and so forth. So if that's some of the law and policy involved in contemporary border and immigration enforcement, what are some of the agencies involved then with enforcing that law and policy? Many of us, I am sure, are familiar with ICE and CBP, but ICE itself, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and even the Department of Homeland Security are actually less than 25 years old here in the United States, created through the passage of the Department of Homeland Security Act of 2002, just after the September 11th attacks in 2001. To give you some sense of organizational clarity here, we see a number of different acronyms today like ERO or HSI or Border Patrol even, and so it's worth spending just a minute to kind of make sense of where all of these fall. Both CBP and ICE are housed under the Department of Homeland Security, which, as I mentioned, was created roughly 25 or so years ago with that Department of Homeland Security Act of 2002. Customs and Border Protection, or CBP, is divided into two sub-agencies, one known as the Office of Field Operations. This typically operates at ports of entry or sometimes along international bridges. Think here of kind of customs inspections. What many of us probably think about when we think about border and immigration enforcement is actually Border Patrol or US Border Patrol, which is just one subset of customs and border protection more largely. On the other hand, the Department of Homeland Security also houses ICE, or Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Again, there are two important sub-agencies here, HSI, which stands for Homeland Security Investigations. In the past, this was used to investigate things like drug trafficking or threats of terrorism, but nowadays HSI is actually leveraged against immigration enforcement, much like ERO or Enforcement and Removal Operations does. The point here is that there are a number of different agencies and organizations really responsible for enforcing border and immigration enforcement. And in particular, under the Trump administration, the distinctions between Border Patrol, let's say, which has historically enjoyed a kind of exterior mandate along the US-Mexico border, and the distinction, let's say, with ICE, which has an interior mandate to enforce immigration law within the United States, has more or less been erased. And it is now more or less a kind of organizational or institutional free-for-all when it comes to kind of border and immigration enforcement. So to just close very quickly then, this kind of historical and institutional context and the ways in which border and immigration enforcement are currently unfolding, I think, are buffered by a few important constitutional protections that importantly apply to both citizens and non-citizens alike. Although I should note that much of these protections and rights come with large caveats, depending upon a wide variety of circumstances that I'm happy to get into or explain later. Mostly, we can refer to the 4th, 5th, and 14th Amendments and their kind of protections and rights that, again, really apply to both citizens and non-citizens alike. Many of you might be familiar with these. They protect all individuals from unreasonable search and seizure. They ensure due process and protection from self-incrimination, and they also preserve equal protection under the law, respectively. In other words, you don't have to open the door if immigration authorities are present and knocking. You don't have to answer any questions from immigration authorities or really even speak to them at all. And for that matter, you probably shouldn't sign anything without really consulting or speaking to an attorney first. And again, these are all protections offered by these 4th, 5th, and 14th Amendment rights. Although again, the caveat being that they have kind of more or less been eroded in the past couple of years under the second Trump administration in particular. So with that, I'm going to cede my time and sort of pass the baton on to Rita and the next panelist, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jared. And we're already seeing some questions come in, but if anyone has any questions, you can put it in the Q&A and we will get to it after every panelist has been able to provide their presentation. So just keep adding those questions in there. We're gonna move to Sarah. Sarah, many public conversations about immigration assume that if someone has lived in the United States for years, works here, pays taxes, and has family here, there must be a straightforward process to obtain legal status. A local study funded by Diversity Coalition and other local partners and available at our website, diversityslo.org, about the immigrant population in SLO County tells us that 82% of immigrants in SLO County have been in the U.S. for over 20 years. A question I often hear is, if they have been here for so long, why aren't they citizens already? As an immigration attorney, Sarah, can you help us understand what legal pathways actually exist and why the process is often much more complicated than people assume?
Yes. Let me get to um, get to the right screen. Okay. Oh, I maybe shared the wrong screen. 1 minute. I have too many screens open.
That's okay. It's Wednesday.
Okay. Um, yes, so I will definitely get to that question. I wanted to start with, I would get to the question of what is the process for becoming lawful. Um, I wanted to start with well, I often hear people talk about someone who's legal or illegal, right? Something about, oh, we should deport the illegals. They need to go back and get in line. So I want to start with this diagram, which shows kind of that there's a continuum of lawful statuses, of immigration statuses in the US. Um, Very interesting. I believe my slide is going to be backwards. I'm just now noticing. Um, So at the top half of the screen, you can see these are immigrant statuses. These are people who are coming to the US and want to stay in the US. They intend to reside here. There are also non-immigrant statuses, people who only intend to come for a short time to visit or work and intend to return to their own country. And then there's the continuum. You can be lawful all the way to unlawful, either in the immigrant or the non-immigrant status. So unlawful and lawful are reversed on the screen. Um, so just now, US citizen would be the most lawful status. Sorry, I had somebody make slides for me and got a little confused. So a US citizen intends to stay here and they're lawful. The next, by the way, I made this continuum up just based on my experience. There are various places along the continuum where people could disagree, maybe, but this is more or less what I think is sort of the ranking of statuses and why just saying lawful, unlawful, or illegal and legal is not correct. A lawful permanent resident has their green card. A conditional permanent resident has their green card, but they got it through marriage. And so after 2 years, they have to prove they're still legal. um, People who come and have been granted asylee or refugee status. So refugees apply outside of the US, asylees apply in the US, but it's the same thing. They're seeking protection from their own country. Now we're kind of toward the bottom half of this is really should be unlawful. Um, There are deferred action statuses. You're not really in status, but you're also not really unlawful yet. you're not in status, but the government prior to this administration recognized that you were in the process of becoming lawful. You can be in these statuses, the U or the T visa process, a VAWA process, for easily 10 years, 15 years. So you're not legal yet, but you are in the process. Deferred action for childhood arrivals, same thing. You're not really in status, and maybe you will become in status one day. Family unity is very similar. All of these are similar statuses. Family unity is where somebody in your family became a lawful permanent resident through one of the amnesty programs of the 1980s, either through being an agricultural worker or just through the time they spent here. And then they petitioned for their family members. Now, the process to become a lawful permanent resident, I'll get to that in a couple slides, can be between 5 and 25 years. So during that time, people's spouses and children were given family unity, which was just a work permit. Again, they were not here lawfully, but the government recognized that they were here and they were in the process, and that the process was going to take, a long time. And I hit the wrong button. Sorry. Let me get back there. Awaiting your priority date. I'm going to explain that more fully in a couple of slides, but that means somebody in your family has petitioned for you, someone who's legal, a US citizen or a lawful permanent resident, and you're waiting your turn in the line because there's a quota system. Now, closer, essentially what would be considered unlawful is someone who entered the US without inspection, has no status here, they are just here unlawfully. And then I guess the most unlawful status as an immigrant would be someone who's been deported and then comes back unlawfully. So they hope to stay here. They might have a wife or husband, they might have children, but they've been deported and come back, so they are unlawful here. Still unlawful would be, so I'm at the bottom of the screen, and these are non-immigrant statuses. These are people who did not intend to move to the US and stay here forever, make a home here. So someone who enters with a visa but then overstays, they are unlawful. Somebody with temporary protected status, generally they came here various ways, but for whatever reason, the US government has decided that it would be dangerous for them to go back to their own country. It can be a natural disaster, it can be a hurricane and mudslides, it can be civil war. There are various reasons why we give people temporary protected status, but in the end, it's thought that they will either go back to their own country or apply through another program, maybe asylum, maybe they get married while they're here. So they're here temporarily but lawfully. Someone who enters on a tourist visa and it hasn't expired, they are here lawfully. There's various short-term visas that are non-immigrant visas, and the people are here lawfully. So it can be, for example, exchange or training visa like au pairs, vocational students, university students, and visas related to specific employers. Often there'll be nurses, software engineers, physical therapists, someone coming to work for BMW in the United States, but someone who's German, that they would be here lawfully. So now, what that was just to show, there's a very wide range of people, and if someone says, why don't they just do it lawfully? Often we don't even know what status the person they're talking about is in. There are a lot of different statuses they can have. But now I am going to focus on people who want to become lawful permanent residents. And I'm specifically focusing on family petitions. So a U.S. citizen can petition for it's an immediate relative, is their spouse, their child under 21, or their parent. Those beneficiaries of that petition are not subject to a quota, and they can apply for their green card. That process can take, maybe 2-ish years, probably 2 to 3 years. A U.S. citizen can petition for their unmarried son and daughter who is over 21. Son and daughter basically means over 21 in immigration law. Their married son or daughter or a sibling. A lawful permanent resident can petition for their spouse, child under 21, or an unmarried son or daughter over 21. On this table or chart, when the U.S. citizen petitions for an unmarried son or daughter, a married son or daughter, or a sibling, they are subject to the quota system. The lawful permanent resident relatives are all subject to the quota system. And this, I'm going to just kind of try to explain this quickly, but as least complicated as I can. So we have a quota system. Every month, the Department of State says how many people can apply for visas from each country. So I'm going to use an example, Mexico. Basically, the date that a family member petitioned for somebody. So I'm going to use as an example, a lawful permanent resident wants to petition for his wife and children. The date he files the petition becomes their priority date. So we'll use as an example, a Mexican man petitioned for his spouse and children under the age of 21. So you look at the F2A row, and then you go across to Mexico. The reason 4 countries have their own numbers is the quota system only allows 7% of visas to go to people from any one country per year. And because China, India, Mexico, and the Philippines have the most immigrants, those countries are more impacted by the quota system. The column that says all chargeability areas, that means the rest of the world. So we have this Mexican man. He filed a petition for his spouse and children under the age of 21. Let's say he filed in December 2023. In June of this year, they can apply for their green cards because the priority date or the visa bulletin says that people who have their petition filed before January 1, 2024 qualify. So the spouse and the children who remain under 21 can apply in June of 2026. Now let's imagine one of those children was 20 when he filed and is now 22. That person has now fallen from F2A to F2B. And you can see for Mexico, the F2B, unmarried son and daughter over 21, they have to have their petition filed before February 15th, 2009, which means that 22-year-old child, well, adult child, has fallen out of the packet and will not have status. So they might already be in the US, their entire family is in the US, but they've fallen they no longer have status and no longer really have a way to get status. They just have to keep waiting. They could go back to Mexico and wait. Under prior administrations, it was recognized that people in that situation often would stay here. I mean, partly that's why we have deferred action, DACA. As long as they weren't committing crimes, in general, our government was not necessarily looking for people who had fallen into a different priority date or visa category. Under this administration, that person would definitely be termed illegal, just under the rhetoric of this administration. I think I'm going to skip this part. This is just a second, more complicated part of the visa bulletin. Basically, you can apply before your visa priority date becomes current. And then when the date is, it gives you kind of a little warning that soon you're going to be able to apply. So under this administration, I would say that the ways people who have been in the process, following the correct process, and who were kind of recognized to be in the process, assuming there are no criminal convictions, in the past, they were able to stay in the US and kind of wait for their case to be heard. This administration is making it much more difficult. Some of the things that have happened in the past year or so are that asylum applications, people who came in after November 19th, 2019, and applied for asylum, the US made agreements with El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, and Uganda that we would close their asylum applications. People from, as long as they're not from those 4 countries, they would get deported to those countries and they could apply for asylum in those countries. That way, we were not adjudicating their asylum applications, but we also weren't sending them back to their own countries directly. Once they got to those other countries, they probably did get sent back to their own country. And this happened early on under this administration, and we saw on the news, people going to court and then being detained at court and saying, "Why am I being detained? I'm here." And that was these applicants. So for adjustment of status, the process I just really quickly explained, what we have started doing is people will apply for adjustment of status when their priority date becomes current, go to their interview, and then be detained even though they do qualify for adjustment and could be approved right there. Not everyone is being detained, but enough people are being detained nationwide to make it a fear. Just about a week and a half ago, a new memo came out saying that we prefer that people do not apply for their green card in the US, that they go back to their own country, to the US consulate in that country, except in extremely rare or limited circumstances. This is not what our law actually says. I mean, our law allows for people to apply for their green card in the US. Most people who enter lawfully with a visa, if they do eventually either get married and apply through a family member or have a job where they can apply through their job, generally don't want to go back to their own country. I mean, it'll be a couple month wait, it'll interfere with their job. There's a lot of reasons why they would prefer to stay here, and which they are allowed to do. We've paused visa processing for people from 75 different countries while we supposedly make sure they don't become public charges. And we are systematically terminating TPS for countries around the world. TPS, like I mentioned, was temporary protected status. And that is where the government has decided that the people from that country should be able to stay while their own country kind of gets either recovers from the disaster or civil war. Basically, since January 2025, we have terminated TPS for 7 countries. And the wording says, after reviewing the country conditions and consulting with the appropriate U.S. government agencies, Secretary of Homeland Security Kristi Noem determined that whichever country no longer meets the conditions for its designation for temporary protected status. We've terminated for, that means we think it's safe for the residents of the citizens of that country to go home. We have terminated TPS for Somalia, Myanmar, Ethiopia, Haiti, South Sudan, Syria, and Yemen. But all of those terminations have been stopped by courts. Venezuelan TPS was terminated, and the Supreme Court upheld that. And still currently, so 3 countries still have TPS where it was designated under Biden and it expires later this year. That's El Salvador, Sudan, and Ukraine. And Lebanon's was just recently extended. So there used to easily be 20 countries on this list at any given time. And we're essentially trying to do away with TPS, it seems like. I know that was a lot of information really fast, and I could have explained adjustment of status better, but it's pretty technical. But if you have any questions about that, please just put them in the chat and I can explain that better at the end.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you for also updating us on the recent attacks on immigration. You as an immigration attorney see this every day. That table that you presented us with the status and when someone can petition and what category they fall, that's actually a table that I'm familiar with because it would be a table that we would refresh every so often in my family because when I was 6 years old, my dad left Peru, where I'm from, and came to the United States. Shortly after, when he was able to petition us, he requested me and my siblings. I was a minor. And so I was 6 when he left. He probably petitioned us when I was 8. I didn't hear about an update until I was 11. And then my siblings, because they were over 21 and they crossed that threshold at some point, they didn't hear back on the process until I was 24 years old. And so they were already in their 30s. And by then, they had kids and lives. And so it's a table and it can be technical, but it has a huge impact on the families. And that was us doing it, quote unquote, the right way, right? Waiting. And that is just an unrealistic amount of time for many, many families. So thank you so much for bringing that up. We're gonna now talk with Primitiva, from 805 on DocuFund. We've spent some time discussing the legal framework and the history and context of immigration enforcement, but laws and policies ultimately affect people, like we just shared. Primitiva, throughout your career, you've worked alongside communities navigating many kinds of crises, from natural disasters and emergencies to immigration enforcement and family separation now. Can you share with us the work of the Rapid Response Network and the work that 805 on DocuFund is leading and how we can be part of it?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Rita and the League of Women Voters for inviting us to be part of this important panel. And the information I'm going to be sharing is really what 805 on DocuFund has seen on the ground in the Tri-County region. As Sarah was reviewing the data of how one can get in line and apply for some kind of legal status, I've been in conversations with attorneys where really we were facing this type of problem. One factor is because there hasn't been a comprehensive immigration reform since 1965, one could argue. There have been several changes to the law, to the immigration law after that, that give certain groups of people protection, but never a comprehensive immigration reform that applies to all people who are in the United States unlawfully, and that vary in that spectrum that Sarah was sharing with us. And that is why we are seeing what we are seeing under not only this administration, but prior administrations, but more alarmingly under this administration. So this is a phone number that I was reviewing the participant list. Some of you may be familiar with it, but if you're not, please save it. This is our rapid response hotline number where you can call or text if you see a suspected ICE activity in the Tri-County region. We have operators supporting 24/7 to the extent possible. And what we are seeing on the ground is ICE and Department of Homeland Security in places and rolling out the changes in immigration law that are constantly changing and evolving. Something that's in our minds are the elections that are happening, the midterm elections, and I just want to bring the attention that in the city of Simi Valley, yesterday there was verified ICE agents that were around polling places. That is something that we were monitoring and will be monitoring for November and then for upcoming years as well. And these are some of the numbers that we have been documenting since January 14 of last year. So the Rapid Response Hotline, the Rapid Response Network, as it's operating, it was started during the first Trump administration because, again, there was a big a crackdown on illegal immigration was a part of the agenda, the rhetoric. So we knew that if we were facing a second Trump administration, it was going to be very similar. And the numbers tell that truth, that what advocates and immigrant rights organizations, when we found out of the election results, we have been proven right that this administration was going to be targeting the immigrant community. But something that we have realized early on is that the level of aggression and violence that we saw was unexpected. We did not foresee this level of unlawfulness from a federal department like Homeland Security. And what we have been documenting on the ground have been just severe violations to people's constitutional rights, whether documented or undocumented, as the first speaker just reviewed how U.S. citizens, civilians standing up and upholding the Constitution and everyone that it's that's protected under the Constitution have lost their lives. Here, what we have seen on the ground is that in our region, till today, we've had 2,087 community members that have been ripped apart from their families in the Tri-County region. In San Luis Obispo County, that's 144 that we have documented and verified, 112 in the city of San Luis Obispo, 24 in Paso Robles, 10 in the small community of San Miguel, 5 in Arroyo Grande, 3 in Ipomo, 3 in Atascadero, 2 in Grover Beach, and 2 in Oceano. For Santa Barbara County, the numbers start increasing. Santa Barbara County, 857. Santa Maria being the most impacted city with 539 community members taken in the city of Santa Maria, followed by Lompoc and then city of Santa Barbara. Moving on to Ventura County, we see 987. Ventura County being the most impacted county, with city of Camarillo with 485, Oxnard 194, and Ventura 116. We must remember that we had the glass house operation here in the city of Camarillo, which accounts for at least 350 of this 485 number. And I want to take it back to what we are seeing here in San Luis Obispo County, because this is primarily the audience is from San Luis Obispo, that even though the San Luis Obispo County seems to be the less impacted county among the three that we cover, it should still be alarming for the community, because when we compare San Luis Obispo County to other counties, similar in population, similar in demographics, other counties are not seeing nearly enough or nearly the same level of apprehensions and kidnappings as San Luis Obispo County. We attribute this to an ICE field office being in the city of Santa Maria, making it very strategically for them to target the city of Santa Maria and the communities of San Luis Obispo. So this is what we are seeing on the ground, and I can share information with the League of Women Voters on how people can get involved and support the work on the ground on protecting all communities from the unjust and cruel attacks of this administration. And as our first speaker was referring to the Chinese Exclusion Act, it was also reminding me of something that we are seeing very similar today, which is this website that is under the White House. It is a website on the White House that has been created with taxpayer dollars to criminalize and to dehumanize the immigrant community by comparing them to aliens. Even if you see here the colors that they use on the website, and it's something like pulled out of a movie, but yet it stands on the website of the White House. So, I mean, what we have seen throughout history isn't in the past. We are seeing history repeat itself, and those same tactics that were used in the past are being used today by to offer some a glimmer of hope. The community is also taking from different civil resistance movements from history and from other parts of the world, where organizing and organizing in ways that can destabilize the status quo have been proven by other movements in other parts of the world to defend democracies, to turn around the tables, and to win social resistance movements throughout the world, throughout history.
Thank you so much, Primi. Thank you for all the work that 805 on DocuFund is doing. We have some questions in the Q&A, and I see some of the panelists. Feel free to answer the questions directly. Some of them are very specific. So I want to actually bring up a topic to all of the panelists. So Jared and Sarah, you guys can also join in, and Primi, if you want to answer any of these two questions that I have. Listening to y'all's presentation, but also seeing what's happening in the news, we know that In the last 2 weeks, Delaney Hall in New Jersey has received national attention. We know that detainees have launched hunger strikes. Members of Congress have tried to do inspections, and there are lawsuits that are being filed right now to investigate conditions. But we've heard from other detention centers where there have been worms found in food and there's no access to water. The conditions are horrible, inhumane. And we're also hearing from a recent Associated Press investigation where they're finding that suicides in ICE custody are occurring at the highest rate in the agency's history. I can continue, going on and the different cases and news articles that we are seeing coming out from these detention centers. And so my thinking is like, regardless of where people stand politically on immigration policy or what or suggestions are on immigration reform, right now, I have just two, I think, broader questions. First, and I'll mention to both of you, to all of you, and you can answer either of them. Is there any meaningful oversight on immigration detention currently or in immigration enforcement that you all can, shine light on? And the second question really is it's more local. If we know that detention can result in family separation and prolonged confinement and deteriorating mental and physical health, and in some cases, death, why do you think these conditions have generated relatively limited public attention and action, right? We are seeing protests, but they're not necessarily widespread. And we're not seeing the political urgency compared to other public policy issues. I invite you all to answer either of them around oversight and why do you think there's not enough political urgency around these issues?
I mean, I'll start with the first one about oversight of the detention facilities. There is not enough oversight. I mean, ICE is opening more, well, contracting with private contractors to open more detention facilities. They're opening them quickly. They are not staffed appropriately. They aren't sending enough food to them. They do not have like pharmacies where people who take medication can get their medication. You cannot take your own medication to a detention facility. And if you get detained and you take something daily, it can take ICE 30 days to get your medication, or more, if they even try. So no, there is not enough oversight. I mean, I know that another detention facility in McFarland, there's the Golden State Annex, and they just opened another one in McFarland. A couple of weeks ago, I had a client transferred, so it's a new one there. So we just don't even hear about it. And they're opening them too fast, and honestly, because they're private detention facilities, they just give a bunch of money, and then because they are not nonprofits, they're profit driven, they are providing the least amount of anything, of everything possible, in my opinion.
Definitely. Jared or Primi, anything that you'd like to add? I can also pull up more questions.
I'll let Primi go first if she wants to.
I'm okay. I was trying to answer some of the questions on the Q&A. Sorry.
It's okay.
Yeah, just to echo Sarah's point, the one you're thinking of is Central Valley Annex. I actually just took a group of 12 students there last weekend, or the weekend before, to visit detainees. And that was a private facility. I think one of the things that's worth noting here, Sarah, that you alluded to is something around 9 out of every 10 immigrants who are detained in a privately owned or operated facility. And what that means is that roughly 90% of all immigrant detention capacity in the United States is run by for-profit corporations and companies like Geo Group, CoreCivic, And the level of oversight is obviously lacking, and it is, a huge concern. Um, with regard to kind of immigration enforcement more broadly, there isn't a lot of judicial oversight or judicial review. A lot of that has been chipped away rather methodically through certain iterations of law and policy, like the IIRA in 1996. Which did technically chip away at due process rights for immigrants through things like expedited removal, or reinstatement of removal, which Sarah had referred to as well. And so this is a kind of caveat that comes along with immigration law and policy, and one of the reasons why I think it's so important to kind of teach about plenary power or plenary authority. It is a real kind of like fundamentally undemocratic way of doing governance that we have here in the United States. And to sort of address your second question, Rita, I think there's a real ambivalence toward racialized populations and toward immigrants in particular. It's a kind of historical cycle here in the United States. And again, I think it's why I often start with the Chinese Exclusion Act. I think, of course, of Proposition 187 here in California in the 1990s. That was one of the most restrictive anti-immigrant ballot initiatives passed in the United States. That happened right here in 1994 and passed with an overwhelming percentage of the vote, something like 60 something, 62% of the vote at the time. And I think it's a real reckoning, with the kind of exploitation that comes along with immigrant groups here in the United States. They perform a lot of economic labor, a lot of economic utility, and of course, they are valuable for so much more than that. But it is almost this sort of ambivalence that comes along with immigrant populations that I think unfortunately also means that they are invisibilized, that violence is invisibilized, and so too then is the kind of action around that. And I would encourage everyone in the audience to get involved with the 805 UnDocuFund, to join the hotline, to report ICE sightings, to volunteer for the rapid response group. It really is about protecting our community and keeping our community safe. And that means everyone, regardless of citizenship status or legal status, and really seeing each other as human beings. That I think sounds naive, but really is a fundamental part of the sort of ongoing struggle that we're witnessing right now.
Thank you, Jared. And something that you brought up is how people are seeing what's happening to the American community right now, and the leniency that it is provided because of it's a racialized issue, has been made a racialized issue. But Sarah, I don't know if you can help us understand something. So locally, someone asked in the Q&A about raids, and even though the biggest raid that we have seen here in the county was the one at the end of December, but we have seen consistent kidnappings happening at the jail, and it has, there are plenty of videos of ICE taking people that are allowed to walk out of the jail and that are allowed by the sheriff to walk out of the jail, and then are being picked up by ICE. Can you help us clarify how immigration law and detention and charges and convictions, it all works? Because it can be very confusing for a lot of people who think, well, if they're at the jail, then, they can get picked up, and, immigration law and criminal law are different. But if you can shine some light on it.
Yeah, that's like a huge question. And I mean, there was an earlier webinar, right, on the Trust Act and who the jail is turning over to ICE directly. And that has to do with what the prior convictions, what convictions exist already for that person. However, like you mentioned, people are just being released from jail either on their own recognizance, like they haven't, they've maybe been arrested, stayed the night in jail, or gone in front of a judge. The judge gives them bond. So the case is going through the process, like they don't have a conviction yet, and they are still getting picked up at the jail. And some are being released into the Sally Port where ICE is, right? So I can't really illuminate the issue. I mean, I just can say that yes, ICE is picking people up at our jail. I mean, I think the sheriff has said that some people are turned over when they have one of the prior convictions that makes it where the sheriff can give that information to ICE, and some people are released through the front door. And ICE is waiting in the waiting room. I mean, how ICE knows to wait there that day, I don't know.
Yeah, we are actually from Diversity Coalition. We've been following some findings from just people and observations of some of these kidnappings. And I would like to hear more from Primi as well as the community impact and what those consistent pickups at the jail are the consequences of those pickups. But one thing that I've been made aware of is just the amount of hours that people stay at the jail that, can be very, very prolonged hours. And then the amount of time that ICE is outside the jail and the amount of time that it takes them to pick someone up. And it's within an hour, which is just, suspicious to say the least. But even those consistent pickups happening, even if there are not raids, have an impact on the community. So, Primi, can you tell us a little bit more about what you're seeing those impacts are, even though, they're not the big raids that sometimes people are expecting before taking action?
Yes, absolutely. I was answering a similar question from the Q&A, but if we refer to what is happening in San Luis Obispo only, the pickups at the jail, outside of the jail. So these are not pickups that are allowed or permitted by law. What we're talking about under SB 54, when the sheriff is able to transfer community members directly to ICE, that's done inside within the jail facilities. Those are numbers we are tracking separately. And within our numbers, what is most alarming is what's happening outside of the county, outside of the jail's facilities. As soon as someone is released in a public area, because they are able to be in those public areas, just like we as community members, that's when someone has been released. They've done their time, they've served their time, they've been determined that they're free to go. The only difference is that because they are undocumented, because of how they look, because of their potential name, if they have the list of people being released, that's why they are using to grab people as they are being released. But that's not the biggest problem that San Luis Obispo is dealing with. Like I was saying, the pickups at the jail, outside of the jail, aren't happening as frequent compared to other cities, Santa Barbara, Ventura. So that what is more alarming is the more systemic and strategic ways in which DHS and ICE is operating, where we have seen recently that people are now being taken at their immigration appointments. These are people that were doing everything they were asked by this government to do, and are being, when they're interviewed, they disclose more information that they should, and now and are being taken at one of these immigration appointments. So we're not seeing community members, at least this year, being taken in the community during early morning hours at worksite raids. What we are seeing is an almost daily presence at the different jails, and as well as people being taken at their immigration appointments because their status is changing. That's where the focus has been, away from the cameras. So I wasn't surprised by one of the questions being, is activity decreasing, where in where it's really the other way around. If we compare our numbers, which are pretty accurate numbers, because we were matching our numbers to the numbers from the White House in that shameful website they have, and they're pretty accurate. On some of those some cities, we're like equal. What they have is what we have. So we know that we've been accurately documenting that data. And what we are seeing is that people, if we look at the data for these 5 months compared to the 5 months from last year, we are seeing 6 times more apprehensions happening. So it's happening far more, and it's just not happening violently, where there's a camera and it's going viral because someone's hand got broken, or it was done in a violent manner. It's happening alarming higher numbers. It's just not your violent kidnapping that is going viral.
Thank you so much for all that context, Primi. We are 10 past 1. We will allow the panelists to continue answering some of the questions coming in through the Q&A. There is one question that I wanted to pose to the panelists. And it kind of goes back to what Jared presented at the beginning of this idea that the administration is pushing to who belongs and who doesn't belong in our society, right? We're seeing something very similar happening with to the trans community, for example, right? This argument of who belongs, who doesn't, what does that person should look like. We're seeing it too with religious minorities in the U.S. There's, even voting rights, who gets more voting rights, who doesn't get voting rights. As the United States approaches its 250th anniversary, what can history teach us about moments where Americans narrowed or expanded this definition of who belongs? And any last comments from the panelists considering this belonging argument? Jared, Sarah, Primi, feel free to. I know Primi's answering questions in writing.
I'll just kind of go off what Jared said earlier. I was going to mention, he said it like very diplomatically that the US is, I don't even remember the word you use now. I feel like over the past 25 years, we have gotten much more exclusionary about who belongs. I feel like the rhetoric coming out of higher levels of government, and then that you see all the way down into, newspaper editorials or letters to the editor or on social media, some of them are really quite dehumanizing and horrifying. I can't remember what Jared said, but it was very polite and diplomatic. So, I mean, I am not super optimistic right now that we're moving toward immigration reform. I mean, I would love to be wrong. I would love to be wrong.
Yeah. Jared?
Sorry, responding to a kind of comment in the Q&A. Yeah, I think as a scholar, I'm sort of trained to look for patterns. And one of the patterns that does emerge is that there is a long history and a certain continuity to the kind of exclusion that has been very much a part of the United States since its inception, a country that was built on the institution of slavery. That institution of slavery that was written into the Constitution through things like the Three-Fifths Compromise, which many of you probably remember from your high school American history class. But often those moments of exclusion really peak around moments of economic and social uncertainty as well. Immigrants in particular are a very convenient scapegoat for the kind of anxieties, fears, and uncertainties. Again, referencing kind of Prop 187 in California in 1994, it was, of course, not a coincidence that the state itself was dealing with both kind of economic crises, but also environmental crises. Many of you probably remember the earthquakes that happened right before then as well. I think we're sort of seeing something similar here in the United States. I do see a parallel with California. A lot of these fears and anxieties typically center around demographic change. What does it mean to really make sense of the United States becoming more brown, as the statistics indicate? We reckoned with a very similar demographic change in the 1990s here in California, and we did come out through the other side, wounded, hurt, and perhaps not all the better, but somewhat better. And I wonder if, to end on maybe a hopeful note, something somewhat similar will happen here in the United States. I think about myself as a kind of example here. My dad is Dutch, my mom is Mexican. I think of myself as a proud Californian, and that in many ways I think embodies the sort of diversity, the beauty, and the possibility that exists in states like California and really across the United States for people to kind of come together and recognize that diversity and difference and a wide variety of experiences makes life richer, if anything else, and we need to learn how to kind of live with that and cherish that in a way.
Thank you, Jared. There's a quote that I really like from Gracie Lee Boggs that say, "These are the times that grow our souls." And I think I'm leaning towards that hopefulness of these are the times where we get smarter and better and more united. Primi, any final thoughts?
It's I would just really encourage the community of SLO to get involved in different efforts because as I was answering some of the questions, yes, we can put out the data there on a monthly basis. We have monthly organizer meetings where these slides that I shared part of a bigger presentation where we provide updates on patterns that we're seeing on strategy. But ultimately, what we need is people to be moved towards action. We have to get plugged in different efforts. I will be working on non-cooperation trainings in the different Tri-County region where we can learn about how we can throw some sand in the machine to slow it down because it is causing great harm and violence to the immigrant community as well as many other communities. I mean, we focus today on ICE, but what we are seeing from this administration and prior administrations as well is that it's this is a government in crisis. And as such, we have to come together as people, as community, to be able to come over at the other side. This is a civil resistance movement that what is happening here in the Central Coast is not unique. It's not only happening in California, not only in the US, it's happening all over the world. There's a bigger fight against authoritarian regimes, and we all have a very important role to play. So, yes, analyzing the data and everything, but more importantly, is activating. Because if you haven't seen what's going on around you, you're just not paying attention.
Exactly. Thank you so much, Primi. I'm with you. I think we can say 100 as a number, 1,355. There is a point where the numbers don't make any difference unless we do take action. And so if you're here, we thank you so much because that means that you are interested in learning more and being part of the conversation. And it's time to level up. If you have been doing education and learning more about immigration or are an immigrant yourself and know about the process, let's move up and let's level up to advocacy. If you have been doing advocacy for years, which I know some people here, participants have been doing for a long time, let's start answering those phone calls from the hotline and listening to what's happening on the ground and supporting the work. And there are many, many ways of leveling up, and we thank everyone that is doing a little bit of that work in their own corner. I want to thank the League of Women Voters for creating this space and hosting this webinar and allowing us to continue learning. Thank you all for participating on this event. And now I pass it back to Glenn.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the end slides. Thank you, Rita, and the rest of the panel. You guys did a great job. I wish we could go on. Actually, I think we're just, I don't want to use that word. I was going to say, yeah, just looking at the very surface of these issues. But I'm glad that you all joined us today and look forward to seeing you again at a future webinar. We're going to be doing more of these in a series and on other topics as well. The YouTube channel for the League of Women Voters will have this webinar in about 3 days, and you will also have access to all of our previous webinars, including the ones in this immigration series. So I hope that you'll take a look at that. When I leave here, there's going to be an end slide with some information on it. You can copy down or take a screenshot. It'll be up for about 45 seconds or a minute. So there's some contact info there as well as the names of our wonderful panel. And until we meet again, goodbye and thank you for joining us today.